The financial district of Manhattan always came alive at night in its own unique way. While the suited masses retreated to their cozy homes, leaving behind towering glass buildings and empty sidewalks, Mary Chant made these streets her home. At 45, she wasn't what most people expected when they thought of someone experiencing homelessness. Her eyes still held a sharp intelligence, and despite her worn clothes, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Every evening, Mary would carefully arrange her few belongings in the doorway of what she called her penthouse suite, a relatively sheltered entrance to an old office building on Wall Street. She joked to herself about the million-dollar view of the street lights, finding humor even in her difficult circumstances. The security guards in the area had grown used to her presence, some even secretly leaving her coffee or sandwiches when their supervisors weren't looking. That particular December evening felt different from the start. The air was bitingly cold, the kind that made even the hardiest New Yorkers hurry along with collars turned up against the wind. Mary had just finished setting up her cardboard windbreak when she heard the first sound that something wasn't right. At first, it was just a scuffing noise, expensive shoes dragging slightly on concrete. Mary had learned to notice everything around her. It was a survival skill on the streets. She looked up to see a well-dressed older man walking unsteadily. He was clutching his designer briefcase in one hand, but something about his movements seemed off. The man was Robert Lay, though Mary didn't know it then. He was one of those figures you'd see in business magazines, the kind who owned half the buildings in the area. But in that moment, he was just a human being in trouble. His face had gone ashen, and he was starting to lean heavily against the building wall. Mary noticed how he kept touching his chest, his breathing becoming more labored with each step. Having worked as a nurse for 20 years before life took its unexpected turns, she recognized the signs immediately. This wasn't just someone feeling under the weather, this was a heart attack in progress. Without hesitation, Mary sprung into action. She might not have had a home, but she still had her training and her humanity. "Sir," she called out, already moving toward him. "Sir, I think you need help." Robert tried to wave her away, a common reaction she'd grown used to over the years. But before he could complete the gesture, his knees buckled. Mary reached him just in time to help break his fall, guiding him gently to the ground. Her former nursing instincts kicked in fully now, and she quickly positioned him properly while scanning the street for help. The usually quiet evening street had a few passers-by, most of whom were hurrying past, trying their best to ignore what they saw as just another street scene. "Hey!" Mary shouted with an authority in her voice that made people stop and stare. "I need someone to call 911 right now. This man is having a heart attack." A young woman in a red coat pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed, while Mary turned her full attention back to Robert. His pulse was rapid and irregular under her fingers, his breathing becoming more distressed. "Sir, I'm a trained nurse," she told him calmly, maintaining eye contact. "I'm going to help you, but I need you to try and stay with me, okay?" Robert managed a weak nod, fear visible in his eyes. Mary kept talking to him in a steady voice, monitoring his vital signs while waiting for the ambulance. When his heart suddenly stopped, she didn't hesitate. She began chest compressions immediately, counting under her breath, her movements precise despite years away from practice. For 4 long minutes, Mary kept Robert's blood flowing through CPR, ignoring her own exhaustion. A small crowd had gathered now, watching in amazement as this homeless woman performed professional emergency care on the sidewalk. When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics found her still performing perfect compressions, giving detailed medical information as they took over. As they loaded Robert into the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to Mary. "You just saved this man's life," he said simply. Not many people would have known what to do, or would have even stopped to help. Mary just nodded, already retreating back to her doorway as the ambulance pulled away with lights flashing. She couldn't know then that this chance encounter would change both their lives forever, or that the simple act of helping another human being would lead to discoveries that would shake her world to its core. She settled back into her makeshift bed, pulling her thin blanket around her shoulders. The excitement of the evening had left her drained but somehow more alive than she felt in years. As she watched the ambulance disappear around the corner, she said a quiet prayer for the stranger whose life she'd just saved, never imagining that he would soon return to save hers in ways she couldn't imagine. The next few days on the street felt strangely empty for Mary. She kept replaying that evening in her mind, wondering how the man she helped was doing. The winter had grown harsher, and she found herself huddling deeper into the layers of donated clothes she'd collected over the months. Still, something about that night had awakened a part of her she thought was long buried, the caregiver, the professional, the person she used to be. Meanwhile, in the pristine halls of Mount Sinai Hospital, Robert Lee was beginning to regain his strength. The doctors had told him repeatedly how lucky he was. If it hadn't been for the immediate CPR he received, the massive heart attack would have likely been fatal. As he lay in his private room, surrounded by flowers and get-well cards from business associates, his thoughts kept returning to the woman who had saved his life. "A homeless woman, you say?" he asked his personal assistant, Linda, who hadn't left his side since the incident. And she knew exactly what to do. Linda nodded, tapping away at her tablet. According to the paramedics' report, she identified herself as a former nurse. They said her technique was perfect, textbook CPR. Without her, you wouldn't have made it to the hospital. Robert stayed out the window at the city skyline, his city, or at least the parts of it he owned. He'd spent decades building his real estate empire, always focused on the next deal, the next acquisition. Now, lying in this hospital bed, none of that seemed as important as the simple act of kindness from a stranger who had nothing to gain. "Find her," he said quietly. "Please, Linda. Find the woman who saved my life." The search wasn't easy. The financial district was large, and many homeless people moved around constantly, seeking shelter from the bitter cold. But Linda was persistent. She spoke to security guards, showed photos from security cameras, and finally got a lead. Mary was well known in the area, it turned out, respected by both the local business owners and her fellow homeless people for her dignity and kindness. 1 week after the incident, Linda found Mary in her usual doorway. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and Mary was trying to stay warm by doing small exercises, moving her arms and legs to keep the blood flowing. "Are you the woman who helped Mr. Lee last week?" Linda asked, approaching carefully. "The one who performed CPR." Mary looked up, surprise crossing her weathered face. "Is he okay?" she asked immediately, showing more concern for his welfare than curiosity about why someone was looking for her. "Thanks, Steve, yes, he's recovering well, and he'd very much like to meet you." Mary's first instinct was to decline. She'd helped because it was the right thing to do, not for recognition or reward. But something in Linda's sincere expression made her reconsider. "I'm not really dressed for visiting," she said, gesturing at her worn clothes. Linda smiled warmly. "We can take care of that. Mr. Lee is still in the hospital, and he's quite insistent about thanking you in person." The next few hours felt surreal to Mary. Linda took her to a nearby department store where she was given new clothes, simple but warm and clean. She was able to shower and wash her hair in the store's employee bathroom, and when she looked in the mirror, she caught a glimpse of her old self, the person she'd been before everything fell apart. At the hospital, Mary felt strangely nervous. She'd spent countless hours in hospitals before, but always as a nurse, never as a visitor to a private room on the top floor. When she entered, Robert Lee was sitting up in bed, looking much better than the last time she'd seen him. "So you're my guardian angel," he said warmly, extending his hand. "The doctors tell me I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Mary shook his hand, feeling slightly embarrassed. "Anyone with the same training would have done the same thing," she said softly. "But they didn't. You did." Robert gestured for her to sit down. "Linda tells me you were a nurse." And so Mary found herself telling her story, something she rarely shared. She told him about her 20 years as an ER nurse, her passion for helping others, and then the series of events that had led to her current situation, the illness that drained her savings, the missed rent payments, the eventual eviction. She spoke without self-pity, stating the facts as they were. Robert listened intently, occasionally asking questions. His eyes showed not pity, but understanding and something else, recognition, perhaps. When Mary finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment. "Life can change in an instant," he said finally. "One moment I was walking to my car, the next I was on the ground, my life in the hands of a stranger." You gave me a second chance at life, Mary. I'd like to return the favor. Mary started to protest, but Robert held up his hand. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering an opportunity, a chance to rebuild, to use your skills again. The world needs more people like you, Mary, people who stop to help others without asking what's in it for them. As they continued talking, neither of them could have known that this conversation was just the beginning. Their fate had brought them together for reasons far beyond a chance encounter on a cold winter night. The real surprise, the truth that would change both their lives forever, was still waiting to be discovered. The following weeks passed in a blur for Mary. Robert had arranged for her to stay in a small but comfortable apartment near the hospital while he continued his recovery. At first, she felt out of place in the clean, warm space, like she was living someone else's life. She would wake up in the middle of the night, momentarily confused by the soft bed and the absence of street noise. The apartment came with basic furnishings and a fully stocked kitchen, but what touched Mary most was finding her new closet filled with nursing scrubs in her size. It was a silent acknowledgement of faith in her ability to return to her profession, and it brought tears to her eyes when she discovered them. Robert's recovery was progressing well, but he insisted on having Mary visit regularly to check his vital signs and discuss his medication schedule. They both knew it was partly an excuse. He had a team of medical professionals at his disposal, but these visits had become meaningful for both of them. They would talk for hours, sharing stories about their lives and discovering they had more in common than anyone might have guessed. I started with nothing to, Robert told her one afternoon as they sat in his hospital room sharing a puzzle. People see the success now, but they don't see the struggles it took to get here. He paused, moving a puzzle piece into place. You know what impressed me most about you, Mary? Not just that you saved my life, but how you carried yourself with dignity despite everything. Mary smiled, remembering her penthouse suite on the street. Sometimes dignity is all you have left, she said quietly, and helping others, it reminded me I was still me, no matter where I slept at night. Robert's personal assistant, Linda, had become a regular presence in Mary's new life too. She helped Mary navigate the process of reinstating her nursing license, which had lapsed during her time on the streets. They spent hours together gathering documents, filing paperwork, and preparing for the reinstatement exam. You know, Linda said one day as they worked on the application forms, I've never seen Mr. Lee so invested in someone's success before. There's something special about your connection with him. Mary had noticed it too, a familiar comfort in their interactions that seemed to go beyond their shared experience that night on the street. She'd caught him looking at her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. The local clinic where Mary had been offered a position was just a few blocks from her new apartment. The staff there had been welcoming, though Mary could sense their initial uncertainty about her background. But as soon as she started working with patients, her experience and natural compassion shone through. One elderly patient grabbed her hand after she'd carefully dressed his wound and said, "You've got healing hands, nurse. Like you were born for this work." Mary had to turn away to hide her tears, happy tears for the first time in years. Each day brought new challenges and small victories. Mary had to relearn some things and catch up on others. Medical procedures had advanced during her time away from nursing. But her core knowledge and instincts remained strong. She took extra shifts when she could, staying late to study new protocols and medications. Robert was finally discharged from the hospital, but he made sure to keep in touch. He would send his driver to bring Mary to his office for lunch, where they would discuss her progress and share stories about their days. During one of these lunches, he seemed particularly thoughtful. "Tell me about your family, Mary," he said suddenly, setting down his fork. "You've never mentioned them." Mary's face clouded slightly. "Not much to tell," she said softly. "My father died when I was young. My mother, she remarried and moved away. We lost touch after that. I had an uncle somewhere, but," she shrugged, the old pain visible in her eyes for a moment before she masked it. Robert's expression changed subtly at her words, and he exchanged a quick glance with Linda, who was sitting at a nearby desk. Something passed between them, a look of recognition or realization, but Mary was too focused on her memories to notice. Later that day, Linda made some calls, her voice hushed as she spoke into her phone. She was searching through old records, cross-referencing dates and names. With each discovery, her eyes grew wider and her hands shook slightly as she made notes. What Linda found would change everything. A connection so unexpected, yet so obvious once revealed, that it would shake both Mary and Robert to their cores. But for now, life continued its steady rhythm of healing and renewal. Mary threw herself into her work at the clinic, slowly rebuilding her confidence and professional identity. Each successful procedure, each grateful patient, helped erase the memories of those dark nights on the street. She started making friends among her colleagues who admired her skill and compassionate approach to patient care. As winter began to release its grip on the city, Mary felt herself blooming along with the first signs of spring. She had no way of knowing that the biggest surprise, the truth about her connection to Robert, was about to emerge, like a flower pushing through the last patches of snow. One evening, as she was finishing her shift at the clinic, her phone rang. It was Linda, her voice tight with excitement and nervousness. "Mary," she said, "Mr. Lee needs to see you right away. There's something you both need to know." The sun was setting over the city as Mary made her way to Robert's office, casting long shadows between the buildings where she had once sought shelter. She couldn't have known then that she was walking toward not just another meeting, but toward a truth that would rewrite both their stories forever. The elevator ride to Robert's penthouse office felt longer than usual that evening. Mary watched the floor numbers climb, her mind racing with possibilities about why she'd been called so urgently. The city lights twinkled through the glass walls, reminding her of how far she'd come from those nights on the street just a few months ago. When the doors opened, Linda was waiting for her, practically bouncing with nervous energy. "He's in his office," she said, leading the way. "He's been pacing for the last hour." Mary had never seen Robert's private office before. It was surprisingly warm and personal, with family photos on the walls and well-worn leather furniture that invited you to sit. Robert stood at the window, his back to the door, hands clasped behind him. He turned when they entered, and Mary was struck by the intensity in his eyes. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to a comfortable chair. "What I'm about to tell you, well, I've been trying to figure out how to say it all day." Mary sat, her nursing instincts kicking in as she noticed how tense he seemed. "Are you feeling okay? Is it your heart?" Robert smiled, shaking his head. No, my heart's fine. Thanks to you." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Actually, that's part of why we're here. When you saved my life that night, you set something in motion, something neither of us could have expected." He picked up a folder from his desk and handed it to Linda, who began spreading photographs on the coffee table between them. Mary leaned forward, curious. The photos were old, yellowed with age. They showed a young couple with a little girl, smiling at the camera. "Do you recognize anyone?" Robert asked softly. Mary's hand trembled as she reached for one of the photos. That's my mother," she whispered. "And my father. This was taken at our old house before." Her voice trailed off as she stared at the happy family in the photograph. Robert sat down across from her, leaning forward. "Your father's name was William Chen, wasn't it?" Mary looked up, surprised. "Yes, but how did you?" "He was my brother." The words hung in the air between them. Mary felt the room spin slightly as the implications sank in. But my father never mentioned." "We had a falling out," Robert explained, his voice heavy with old regret. "A stupid argument about the family business. I wanted to expand, take risks. William wanted to keep things small, manageable. Words were said, pride got in the way, and before we knew it, years had passed without speaking." Mary listened, memories flooding back. "I remember him being sad sometimes, looking at old photos, but he never said." "When I heard about his death," Robert continued, "I tried to find you and your mother. But she had remarried and moved away. You changed schools, changed cities. I hired investigators, but..." He spread his hands helplessly. "I looked for years, Mary, my only brother's only child, and I couldn't find you." Linda stepped forward, adding her part to the story. "When you told us your father's name during lunch last week, something clicked. I started digging through Mr. Lee's old family records, cross-referencing everything with your nursing license history. The dates, the names, the old addresses, it all matched." Mary sat back, overwhelmed. The room felt too small suddenly, too full of revelations. "All those years on the street," she said quietly. "All that time." If I had known, Robert said, his voice cracking slightly, if I had any idea you were out there, struggling. He stood up abruptly, walking to the window. I failed your father by letting our stupid fight keep us apart. I failed you by not finding you sooner. Mary stood too, walking over to join him at the window. The city stretched out below them, millions of lights twinkling in the darkness. Some way down there was the doorway where she'd slept for months, the spot where fate had finally brought uncle and niece together in the most unexpected way. You didn't fail anyone, she said firmly. You didn't know. And when we did meet, even without knowing who I was, you helped me. You gave me a chance to rebuild my life. Robert turned to her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. You know what's amazing? You're so much like him, like William. He had that same spirit, that same instinct to help others without thinking about himself. When you saved my life that night, you weren't seeing a rich man or a poor man, just someone who needed help. Linda quietly excused herself, leaving uncle and niece alone with their overwhelming discovery. They talked for hours, sharing stories about William, filling in the gaps in each other's lives. Robert pulled out more family photos, and Mary saw her father Ian again, laughing with his brother in happier times. I have so many questions, Mary said as the night grew late. So many things I want to know about Dad, about our family. We have time, Robert assured her, squeezing her hand. All the time in the world to get to know each other properly, to be a family again. As Mary left the office that night, the city felt different somehow. The same streets she'd once walked in despair now seemed full of possibility. She thought about how life could change in an instant, how a simple act of kindness could set off a chain of events that would uncover long-buried truths and heal old wounds. In her apartment that night, she looked at her reflection in the window, seeing traces of her father's features that she'd never noticed before. She also saw something else, the future, uncertain but full of hope, stretching out before her like the city lights below. The days following the revelation were filled with a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries. Linda had taken it upon herself to dig deeper into the family history, gathering old documents, photographs, and records that would help piece together the story of how the Chen family had drifted apart. One rainy afternoon, Mary sat in Robert's home office, surrounded by boxes of family memorabilia. Each item they pulled out seemed to unlock another memory, another piece of the puzzle. Robert held up an old business card, yellowed with age. Chen Brothers Real Estate, he read aloud, running his finger over the faded text. This was our first office, your father and me. Just a tiny room above a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown. We started with nothing but big dreams and stubborn determination. Mary picked up a photograph of two young men standing proudly in front of a small storefront. Dad kept a copy of this picture, she said softly. He'd had it in his wallet until the day he died. I'd always wondered about the other person in it, but he never talked about you. Robert's eyes grew distant. We were so close back then, inseparable. Everyone called us the dream team. I was the risk taker, the dreamer, and William was the practical one, the planner. Together, we were unstoppable. Linda arrived with more files, spreading them across the large desk. I found the original partnership agreement, she said, pointing to a document. And here's the newspaper article about your first major development project. As they went through the papers, the story of the brothers falling out became clearer. Robert had wanted to take out huge loans to expand rapidly, buying up properties all over the city. William, more cautious by nature, worried about overextending themselves. Your father was right, you know, Robert admitted, shaking his head. I was too ambitious, too impatient. When the market crashed in the late 90s, many developers went bankrupt. If we had expanded as aggressively as I wanted, we might have lost everything. Mary read through old letters between the brothers, watching their relationship deteriorate through formal business correspondence. But why didn't either of you try to make things right? She asked. Robert sighed deeply. Pride. Stupid, stubborn pride. We both thought we were right, both waited for the other to make the first move. Then months turned into years, and the distance between us grew until it seemed impossible to bridge. Linda pulled out another file, this one more recent. After Mr. Chen, your father, passed away, Mr. Li hired several private investigators to find you and your mother. She spread out reports and photographs showing how close they had come several times to finding Mary. You were always moving, Robert explained. By the time we traced you to one city, you had already left for another. And after your mother, he paused, seeing the pain in Mary's eyes. After Mom remarried and moved to California, Mary finished for him. She changed her name, wanted a fresh start. We lost touch after that. Linda pulled up something on her tablet. I found her, she said quietly. She's still in San Francisco. Would you like to? Mary shook her head quickly. Not yet. That's another story for another time. They spent hours going through more photos and documents. Mary found her father's old diary, reading entries that spoke of his regret over the fight with his brother, his hopes for his daughter's future, his pride in her becoming a nurse. He wrote about you here, Mary said, showing Robert an entry. It was right after I graduated nursing school. He wrote, wish my brother could see his niece today. She has his determination, his spirit. Robert had to turn away for a moment, overcome with emotion. When he turned back, his eyes were red. You know what's remarkable, he said. All these years, all these missed connections, and it took a heart attack on a cold street to bring us back together. Mary nodded, remembering that night. Life has a strange way of coming full circle, she said. Dad always used to say that everything happens for a reason, even if we can't see it at the time. Linda brought in some old home movies she'd found in storage. They set them up on a projector, watching grainy footage of two young brothers celebrating Chinese New Year, opening their first office, sharing dreams of success. Look how young we were, Robert marveled. So full of ourselves, thinking we could conquer the world. In a way, you did, Mary pointed out. You both achieved your dreams. Dad built his small but successful business, helping immigrant families buy their first homes. And you built your empire, but never forgot where you came from. As evening fell, they ordered Chinese food from the same restaurant that had once been below their first office. Sitting among the scattered photographs and memories, they shared stories late into the night. Mary learned about her father's childhood adventures, about the sacrifices her grandparents had made coming to America, about the tight-knit community that had helped two young brothers start their business. Tomorrow, Robert said as they were finishing their meal, I want to show you something. The first building your father and I bought together. I've kept it all these years, never sold it, never changed it. Maybe it was my way of holding onto that part of our lives. Mary nodded, feeling a deeper connection to her family history with each passing moment. The street where she had once felt so lost now seemed to hold new meaning, every building potentially holding another piece of her family's story, another chapter waiting to be uncovered. That night, as she got ready for bed in her apartment, Mary found herself talking to her father's photo. You should have told me about Uncle Robert, Dad, she said softly. But maybe you knew that somehow, someday, we'd find our way back to each other. Maybe you knew all along that family has a way of coming full circle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the old brick building in Chinatown as Robert and Mary stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the faded sign that still read Chen Brothers Real Estate in both English and Chinese characters. The small restaurant below was already bustling with the breakfast crowd, the smell of dim sum filling the air. It hasn't changed much, Robert said softly, pulling an old key from his pocket. I've kept everything exactly as it was the last day your father and I worked here together. They climbed the narrow stairs, each step creaking with memories. When Robert opened the door, dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the windows. The office was like a time capsule, two desks facing each other, old filing cabinets along the walls, a coffee maker that had probably last been used decades ago. Mary walked slowly around the room, running her fingers along her father's desk. The calendar on the wall still showed the month he'd left, October 1998. A coffee mug with World's Best Dad written on it sat exactly where he placed it all those years ago. Your mother gave him that mug, Robert remembered, picking it up carefully. The day you started kindergarten, he was so proud, showing everyone pictures of you in your little backpack. Mary opened one of the desk drawers and found a child's drawing, faded but still colorful. I made this, she said in wonder, recognizing her own childish artwork. It's our family, Mom, Dad, and me. And look, she pointed to a fourth figure in the picture. That must be you. I drew you in our family portrait even though I'd never met you. Robert had to sit down, overwhelmed by the sight of the innocent drawing that showed what should have been, a happy, united family. Children often see things more clearly than adults, he said. They understand what really matters. As they continued exploring the office, Linda arrived with a surprise. She tracked down Mr. Wong, the owner of the restaurant downstairs. The elderly man's face lit up when he saw Robert. "Little Lee," he exclaimed, using Robert's old nickname. And he looked at Mary closely. "You look just like your father. William's daughter, yes?" Mr. Wong insisted on closing his restaurant for an hour to sit with them, sharing stories about the early days when two young brothers would come down for lunch, discussing their dreams over bowls of noodles. "They work so hard," he told Mary. "Every day, early morning to late night. Your father always say, 'Mr. Wong, one day my daughter will go to college.' He never forget what matter most." As they talked, more old-timers from the neighborhood dropped by, drawn by the news that Robert Lee was back in his old office. Each person brought another piece of the past, another story about William and Robert Chen, the inseparable brothers who started with nothing and built something remarkable. "Your father helped my family buy first house," one elderly woman told Mary. "Bank say no, but he find a way. He say everyone deserve a home." Robert listened to these stories with growing emotion. "I got so caught up in building bigger things," he admitted. "I forgot what we started out to do, helping people, making a difference in their lives." William never forgot that. Mary thought about her own journey, how she'd chosen nursing to help others, how even when homeless she'd maintained her compassion for those in need. "Maybe I'm more like both of you than we realized," she said. "Dad's dedication to helping others, your determination to overcome obstacles." Later that afternoon, they visited William's grave together for the first time. Mary had been there many times alone, but standing there with Robert felt different. They'd placed fresh flowers and lit incense, honoring Chinese tradition. "I should have been here," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "Should have been here for his funeral, should have been here for you." Mary took his hand. "You're here now. And look at how things worked out. I ended up saving your life right in front of the building you own. Dad must have been watching over us, bringing us together in his own way." As they stood there, a plan began forming in Robert's mind. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "that old office upstairs, what if we reopened it? Not as a real estate office, but as something else. Something that would honor your father's memory and help others." Mary looked at him questioningly. "A community center," Robert continued, getting excited. "A place where homeless people can get medical care, job training, help finding housing. We could call it the William Chen Memorial Center." The idea took hold immediately. Mary thought about all the people she'd met during her time on the streets, good people who just needed a chance, just like she'd been given. "We could have basic medical services," she added. "I know so many nurses and doctors who would volunteer their time." "And I can provide the business expertise," Robert said. "Help people learn job skills, understand finances, navigate the housing market. Everything your father taught our clients, but for those who need it most." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the old office planning. Linda brought in takeout from Mr. Wong's restaurant, and they used the old desks to spread out their ideas. The dust-covered office began to feel alive again with new purpose. "This feels right," Mary said, looking around the room that held so much history. "Like everything that happened, all the pain, all the struggles, was leading us to this moment, to finding each other and finding a way to help others together." Robert nodded, understanding completely. The old photograph of the Chen brothers still hung on the wall, two young men full of dreams and hope. Now those dreams would live on in a new way, through the next generation. As evening fell, they locked up the old office, but not before Mary placed her childhood drawing back on her father's desk. Tomorrow would bring contractors, architects, and planners to start transforming the space. But for now, in the quiet of dusk, the spirit of two brothers and their shared vision of helping others lived on in their legacy. 1 year later, the grand opening of the William Chen Memorial Center was a celebration that brought together people from all walks of life. The old brick building in Chinatown had been transformed, yet somehow still maintained its historic charm. The faded Chen Brothers real estate sign had been carefully preserved and mounted in the lobby, alongside photographs telling the story of two brothers who started with a dream. The morning began with traditional Chinese lion dancers performing on the street, their colorful costumes bringing life to the neighborhood. Mr. Wong's restaurant provided food for everyone, and the sidewalks were packed with people, business leaders in suits mingling with former homeless individuals who had already benefited from the center's pre-opening programs. Mary stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. She wore her nurse's uniform, a choice that felt right for this moment. "A year ago," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I was sleeping in doorways, having lost everything except my desire to help others. Today, I stand before you not just as a nurse, not just as Robert Lee's niece, but as living proof that second chances are possible." She looked over at Robert, who sat in the front row, beaming with pride. "My father and uncle started their business to help people find homes. Today, we're continuing that mission in a new way. This center isn't just about providing services, it's about restoring dignity, rebuilding lives, and remembering that we're all part of one community." The center had already made an impact during its soft opening phase. The medical clinic, staffed by volunteer healthcare workers and led by Mary, had treated hundreds of patients. The job training program had helped dozens of people find employment, and the housing assistance program had already placed several families in permanent homes. Robert took the stage next, his voice thick with emotion. "My brother William had a saying, 'Success means nothing if we don't lift others up along the way.' For years, I forgot that lesson. But life has a way of teaching us what truly matters." He smiled at Mary. "Sometimes it takes losing your way to find your true path." The center was a marvel of thoughtful design. The old office upstairs had been preserved as a museum of sorts, with the Chen brothers' original desks and that precious childhood drawing now properly framed. The rest of the building housed modern medical facilities, classrooms, computer labs, and meeting spaces. Linda, who had become the center's executive director, led tours throughout the day. She showed visitors the Wall of Hope, where success stories were displayed, photographs of people who had found housing, jobs, and healthcare through the center's programs. One of those success stories was Mrs. Zhang, a former seamstress who had lost her home after a workplace injury. Through the center's programs, she had received medical care, job retraining, and help finding affordable housing. Now she taught sewing classes at the center, helping others learn marketable skills. "This place," Mrs. Zhang said during her speech, "it give more than help. It give hope. When you lose everything, hope is most important medicine." The day was filled with touching moments. A group of nurses who had worked with Mary at the clinic presented her with a plaque naming her Healer of the Year. Mr. Wong's grandchildren performed traditional Chinese songs. Former clients of William Chen's real estate business came to share stories about how he had helped their families decades ago. As evening approached, Mary and Robert took a quiet moment in the old office upstairs. The setting sun cast the same golden light through the windows that had illuminated two young brothers' dreams so many years ago. "Dad would be proud," Mary said, straightening the world's best dad mug on her father's desk. "Not just of the center, but of us, finding our way back to being family." Robert nodded, looking at the old family photographs on the wall. "You know what I've learned this past year? Sometimes the biggest acts of kindness come from those who have the least to give. You taught me that night on the street." A knock at the door interrupted their reflection. It was Linda with unexpected news. "The mayor's office called," she said excitedly. "They want to use our center as a model for similar programs across the city. They're offering funding to help expand our services." Mary and Robert shared a look of surprise and joy. What had started as a personal journey of redemption was growing into something bigger than themselves. "We should think carefully about expanding," Mary said, channeling her father's practical nature. "Make sure we don't lose the personal touch that makes this place special." Robert laughed. "You sound just like William." He'd be saying the exact same thing. As they headed back downstairs to join the continuing celebrations, they passed a new addition to the center, a small meditation garden in the courtyard. In its center stood a simple plaque that read, "In memory of William Chen, who taught us that true wealth lies in helping others, and in honor of a chance encounter that brought a family back together." The evening ended with a community dinner in the street, tables stretching down the block. People from all backgrounds sat together, sharing food and stories. Mr. Wong had prepared his famous dumplings, insisting on serving them himself, just like old days. Looking out at the scene, the mixed crowd of people, the laughter, the sense of hope and possibility, Mary felt a deep sense of peace. She had come full circle, from helping others as a nurse to losing everything to being helped herself, and now back to helping others again. But this time she wasn't alone. She had found not just her uncle, but a whole community. The stars began to appear overhead, twinkling just like they had that fateful December night. But now, instead of seeking shelter in doorways, people were finding real help, real hope, and real homes. The legacy of the Chen brothers lived on, transformed but true to its original spirit, helping people find their way home in all the ways that mattered.